a lot of this talk is actually taken from a book by the Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. Does anyone know him? He's the former chief rabbi here in the UK and also the United Hebrew Congregations of the Commonwealth. So a very well-known person. He's passed away now, sadly. So I read this book, a really incredible book by him called Radical Then, Radical Now, which talks about why Jewish people have a very special identity as the chosen people. And it directly connects with us. So that's why I wanted to base this talk on that. One difference between the first generation that joined our church and their children is the question, how is it possible that our children be born into church duties like attending Sunday service, keeping purity, not engaging in sex before marriage, not drinking alcohol, going to the blessing, doing hundoke, and so on and so forth, to which they had not given their consent? You know, how is that possible, and how can we understand that? Because as first generation members, we gave our consent to those things. We joined into those things. But our younger children were born into those things, and they didn't give their consent to start with. So why are they bound by a promise that my generation, not theirs, has given? We promised, right, as older members, but our younger people didn't. So 500 years ago in Spain, near Zaragoza, there was a Jewish rabbi who gained quite a lot of reputation for his very thoughtful and philosophical addresses. And one day he was reflecting on Moses, who, at the end of his life, renews the covenant of Sinai. And that's the covenant that God gave at the Mount of Sinai with the people, that he would be with them if they followed the laws. And he renewed this covenant with the second generation, as it were, some 40 years later, after they'd gone through the wilderness. And God again promised to stay with the Jews and never to abandon them because they were his chosen people. And he was thinking about Deuteronomy 29:10-15 in the Bible. And he was thinking about this quote, and I'll read it to you. All of you are standing today in the presence of the Lord your God, your leaders and chief men, your elders and officials, and all other men of Israel. So the whole of Israel was there. Together with your children and your wives and the foreigners living in your camps who chop your wood and carry your water. So everyone. You're standing here in order to enter into a covenant with the Lord your God, a covenant the Lord is making with you this day and sealing with an oath. To confirm this day as his people, confirm you this day as his people, that he may be your God as he promised you and as he swore to your fathers Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. I am making this covenant with its oath, not only with you who are standing here with us today in the presence of the Lord, but also with those who are not here today. So the rabbi questioned, who did he mean by those who are not here today? Because the whole of the nation was there, including the people who chopped the wood for them. So the whole of the nation were there. It was very clear. The text makes it very clear. And the first generation had already accepted the covenant at Mount Sinai, so he wasn't referring to them. And he realized that Moses meant those who were not yet born, the generations to come. So, what is a covenant then? What do we mean by covenant? Rabbi Jonathan Sacks wrote, a covenant is made when free agents respecting one another's freedom bind themselves by a mutual promise to work together, to be loyal to one another, and to achieve together what can neither achieve alone. So that's a covenant, kind of a special promise. And he wrote that in the Deuteronomy 29 text that we just read, that it was the very basis of Jewish destiny. It says that the covenant is eternal, not just for the people there, but for generations and generations to come. It will bind all future generations. Jews will be born into its obligations. Jewish identity then is not only a faith, but a fate. So that's quite strong and dramatic, right? And at the core of Judaism is that there is this covenantal bond between God and his people. Family Federation, us, we're also a covenantal religion, as are Islam and Christianity as well. They both have covenants with God, basically. All of us have a covenant with God, which means that God makes agreements with us too. You know, I will do such and such for you if you do such and such for me. Right? And True Father said in 1994, just like the Israelites who had to carry the Ark of the Covenant in their 40-year wilderness course, the Unification Church members are now entering the heavenly kingdom carrying the family pledge. So this is our covenant. It's a pledge, it's a promise, right? It is our special family promise to God that we just read one part out today, but there are 8 sections. Like there are 10 commandments, we have kind of 8 pledges, our promises to God. And if we keep those promises, God will consider us his chosen people and will work with us through history. Each morning, if you do it in the morning, we promise to God to live a certain way. And in return, God will consider us as his chosen people and sort of guide us with a broad hand through the kind of large swathes of our life in a certain kind of way. And just like Judaism, ours is a religion of continuity. You know, its existence, our religion's existence, depends on the willingness of successive generations to hand on their faith and way of life to their children. Right? It's very clear. And on the loyalty of children to inherit the heritage of the past. You know, our identity is a given fact at birth, basically. A fact, not a decision. Right? Just like the Jewish people. So let's just look into that a bit more to understand it by heart more rather than just be told, okay, you know, that's how it is. Right? You have to understand it a bit more deeply. So what about history? Let's kind of try and understand history a bit. In War and Peace, I'm sure you've all read it, Leo Tolstoy wrestled with this question of the meaning of history. You know, is it the course of events determined by the decisions of great leaders and generals? Or is there some deeper underlying kind of thread of meaning, a destiny whose outline can be sort of discerned beneath the surface of apparent random, you know, happenings that are going on? So let's just look at ourselves, you know, as people in our society today. We're living in a culture which bears the fruit of several centuries of Western liberal thought, which, you know, beginning in the Enlightenment, have left us to decide who we're going to be. We have to decide ourselves who we're going to be, how to live. You know, we are whoever and whatever we choose to be, and nothing in the past holds us to any particular decision. You know, Western people feel, I can make my life what it is, you know, and I'm free to choose what I want to do. I can be who I want to be, act like I want to act. My morals are just decided by me. I have to find out what they are, work out what's good for me in my life. We're so used to this way of thinking that most people are really unaware of how it crept up on us, which it did creep up on us. We weren't like that before. You know, it started with David Hume in the 18th century, stating that ethics are based on emotion or sentiment rather than abstract moral principle. That was the first step. And then it continued with Immanuel Kant, placing the concept of autonomy at the center of moral life. It's up to you. It's your life. And then ended with the 20th century existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre, arguing that it was up to everyone to create their own existence. It's you, your life, you have to create it. So as a result of this kind of thinking that's permeated our culture, slipped in over the last few hundred years, we think that identity is something we choose, and we have no bonds with the past. As Jonathan Sachs says, no history prescribes our roles. Yeah. However, the divine principle of the family federation, our divine principle, reveals that God is indeed working through history. You just have to look at Principles of Restoration and all the chapters based on that. And God is working to raise up human beings. And that history is in fact the story of God working with his people. First with the Hebrews in the Old Testament age, then the Israelites as they formed a nation, then in the New Testament age with all Christians, and finally with the completed Testament age with us. And we're part of a long story starting with the Jews and continuing through Christian history until now, our own unificationist history, which is just starting. We're very, just a few years into it, right? 50 or so years, not 2,000 or 4,000 years. So it's this fact which helps us to understand why a covenant made with God binds his people through history. As Rabbi Sykes put it, he said, the part that has meaning only in terms of its place within the whole. So that if history has a meaning, then the lives that make it up must in some way be joined to one another as characters in a narrative, figures in an unfolding human drama. Without this, it would be impossible to speak about meaning. Therefore, each of us has significance precisely insofar as we're part of a story, an extraordinary, an exemplary story of a people dedicated to certain ideas. So, of course, he was talking about the Jews, but we can think about ourselves. And an analogy, a very nice analogy that Rabbi Sykes made was that of a library. So he said, imagine that you're in a vast library with thousands and thousands of shelves of books stretching back and back. And we can go to any book, any shelf, and take the book and look at the book, immerse ourselves in the world of its writer. And that book may lead us to follow up with various other books, or on the same subject, or ones with a different approach on that subject. But once we're finished with it, we can just close the book and put it back on the shelf. It makes no claim on us. It's just a book. That's the secular liberal culture view of what identity is. That's how the West sees it. You just pick up a way of doing things. You can put it back. You can leave it. You can live it. It doesn't really matter. It's just a way of doing things. Rabbi Sykes said, we're browsers in the library. There are many different ways of living, and none exercises any particular claim on us. None of them more than any other defines who we are, and we can try any for as long as we like. As browsers, though, we remain intact, untouched. The various lifestyles into which we enter are like the books that we read. We're always free to change them, put them back on the shelf. They are what we read, not what we are. But to be a chosen people opens up a very different kind of possibility. He said, imagine that while you are looking for a book in the library, you come across one that has your family name on it. So you open it in curiosity, and inside there are pages written in many different languages by people stretching back hundreds and thousands of years. And as you read it, you realize that it is the story of each generation of your ancestors, put there by each generation so that the next can learn where they came from, what happened to them, and what they lived for, and why. The last page is blank, except at the top is what?
Your name.
Your name. Yeah, your name. So, by today's Western liberal attitudes, this shouldn't make any difference to you, according to the Western liberal point of view. The past shouldn't bind us, and you're free to be who you want. But in fact, if you had such a book in your hands, you would already be changed by it. You would be fascinated. You'd be intrigued. You'd be wondering, what happened to these people? Who are you really? Where do you really come from? And you could look back through the pages and see that you're connected to your ancestors and their journey. You're not just an individual living in the present, but you're also part of a larger story that has been passed down from generation to generation. This story includes the struggles, triumphs, and values of your ancestors. It would become a form of self-discovery, because you could see who you are, who you were, and how you became what you are. And once I know it exists, I couldn't put the book back on the shelf and forget it. It would be impossible, wouldn't it? Because now I know that I'm part of a long line of people who travel towards a certain destination and whose journey remains unfinished, depending on me to take it further. right? So, the question is then, will I, when the time comes, just hand the book on to my children? Or will I then have forgotten it and given it away, or put it in a museum, or just sold it to a second-hand bookshop and forgotten about it? You know, for the last 2,000 years, Jews remained a distinctive nation without any of the usual prerequisites for a nation. Just think about their situation. You know, they had no land, they had no sovereignty, they had no power, no overarching political structures, not even a shared culture, because they lived in so many different countries. They were scattered over the face of the earth, and almost everywhere they were a minority. And for the most part, they refused active efforts to convert them and resisted the passive pull of assimilation of the cultures around them. In fact, no other people has kept its identity intact for such a long period in such circumstances. Nobody has managed to do that. So how did they do that? How did they manage to keep intact? Because basically they had this very basic conviction that they had entered into a covenant with God that would take them on a journey whose destination lay in the far future, but whose outcomes were of immense consequence for mankind. That was their very deep-born conviction of their identity. So does that sound a bit familiar to you? You know, we feel a little bit the same. You know, we are entered into a special covenant with God, and we're on a journey. Destination lies in the future. We don't quite know when exactly, but the outcome is of an immense consequence to humankind. You know, we're not Jews, nor are we Christians of the New Testament. We're a people of a new lineage, you know, the completed Testament. And through all the thousands of generations of struggle and suffering, a people has been purified step by step. A people has been purified step by step. And we are the first fruit. We are the first fruit of that. Right? In Revelations 14, 3-4, it says, "And they sang a new song before the throne and before the 4 living creatures and the elders. No one could learn the song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. These are those who did not defile themselves with women, for they remained virgins. They followed the Lamb wherever he goes. They were purchased from among mankind and offered as first fruits to God and the Lamb." Talking about us. True Father said, "The completed Testament age is the age of fulfillment. We should fulfill its covenant on the levels of the individual, family, tribe, people, nation, and world. All these levels should be linked, centered on God's love, God's life, and God's lineage. In this way, we will establish one lineage, one love, and one life as a tradition." So, more than first fruits, we're trying to create, well, we are creating a kind of covenantal society. We're not just staying as individuals. The divine principle lays down the basic theory of society. If you read the first chapter, you can see that. And as we restore ourselves, we, people of the pledge, we become pure families, tribes, societies, and nations of the pledge, not held together by force, but by a deep sense of belonging, identity, kinship, and loyalty. Right? Isn't that true? We feel that for each other in a certain, very special way. You know, and there is a centrality of education, the holy days, prayer, and the reading of Hundoke. You know, in education, we pass on our ideals from one generation to the next, and this has a very clear aspect, actually, a very clear point, that it's through education that we can actually pass on these things. You know, in holy days, we transmit our history and memories. In communal prayer, we remind ourselves that we seek what we seek together. Thank you. You know, when we read Divine Principle, you know, which is our covenantal constitution, we reaffirm our existence as a community under the sovereignty of God. And this is how we can build a society of justice and compassion, through these different elements. Centrality of education, our holy days, our communal prayer, our divine principle study, and also our hundoke, and our understanding of who we fundamentally are. So the key to a covenantal society is education. In Genesis 18:19, God said he chose Abraham so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord. He will teach his children and household. In Deuteronomy 6, Moses tells the Hebrews, "These are the commands, decrees of the Lord your God, that God directed me to teach you, to observe in the law that you are crossing the Jordan to possess." So he was told by God to teach the Israelites. In Matthew, Jesus is referred to a teacher. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, it says in Matthew 7. And of course, True Father is known for what? For his teaching. Right? He's an incredible teacher. There are over 1,000 volumes of his speeches. I personally attended a hundoke session with him from 5 a.m. to 3 p.m. Right? And he did that many times. I'm not special. So a people achieves longevity by engraving their values on the hearts of their children, and they on theirs. That's how it's passed down. And we do this by building living monuments, monuments to life, ourselves, people, dedicated to bringing new generations into being and handing them on to the heritage of the past, handing on to them the heritage of the past. So our great institutions are family and education, the conversation between the generations. And we have homes of prayer and of studying teachings. Yeah. So education also, it must lead to truth lived. It can't just be intellectual. So to live the truth requires faith and commitment. We have to actually practice it. As Rabbi Sykes said, science will never settle the question of whether or not God created the universe. Science won't settle that. No historical investigation will ever resolve the question of whether the voice Moses heard at Sinai was real or imagined, the voice of God. No political theory will ever determine whether or not a just and compassionate society is possible. That is not because these things are irrational, it's because they represent truths that can only be made in real life. They have to be made in real life. I can believe, for example, that love exists, or I can believe that it's an illusion. Both views are consistent and coherent, but I must choose, between one or the other, and that choice will shape my life, leading, if I feel that love exists and it's real, it would lead me to marry or stay. If I don't believe that, I would stay aloof. Perhaps having relationships which don't last very long and are not a total commitment. So believing in love, I can find it. Disbelieving it, my world is without it. Right? So faith is neither rational nor irrational. It's the courage to make a commitment. That's what faith is. I always think in my mind this image of Raiders of the Lost Ark, I can't remember what it was, or In Search of the Holy Grail, where he steps off, he's trying to get to the Grail, and he steps onto this bridge, which he can't see is there, and there's a chasm below. But he just does it, right, because he has faith that it's there. He makes this commitment. Right? In a way, we have to make this commitment. That's what our life is about. So one thing is that, of course, education is crucial. Passing on to the generations is crucial. But if we look at our society, we can see that it's very seriously in decline. And therefore, it's even more crucial to study and educate ourselves. We're in a very prosperous society, the 5th, 6th most prosperous nation in the world. But unfortunately, with that, what was prohibited has become abandoned. Values that were considered, important have been lost. The forbidden becomes kind of risque, then avant-garde, and then normal. People are just pushing away the values that they had before, the traditional values. And individualism and self-fulfillment take over from a kind of common purpose. You know, what matters is me and I and myself. And despite warnings from moralists for many years, you know, life seems to continue as normal, but the impact of moral change takes years, even generations, to materialize. And the family is step by step being abandoned. It's very different from when I was younger to what it is today. And by the time social breakdown has become critical, it's already too late to repair. It's not something that you can fix in a day. You know, habits that have been lost and self-restraint has been sort of thrown out the window. People don't even want to hear a moral judgment on their lifestyle because of the liberal view that we should be free to live as we choose. You can't go up to people and say, well, that's wrong, what you're doing is wrong. They'll say, well, you to say, you know, it's my life, what's the matter with you? The trouble is that we discover what doesn't work when it's already too late. You know, life is an unrepeatable experiment, basically. So, to conclude, that is why it's so important for us to hand on, through education, to future generations, our culture, our traditions, our teachings, and our experience. Experience which is often bought at a great price. Yeah. So True Father said in conclusion, in the era of the realm of the fourth Adam, it's like kind of now, I put my children forward. You too should do the same. You men have to raise your wives and put them forward to build a foundation for your extended family. If they cannot, you should do it through your children. To stake your claim as an outpost, you must first prepare your sons and daughters. And once your sons and daughters are united, their mother must stand with them. The Messiah's thought, the teaching of the true parents, is that God can establish heaven's traditions for the sons and daughters through the mother. Through this, we will stake our claim to the tradition of a heavenly nation. This is not a tradition for the family, but a tradition for the nation. The family exists for the nation. All families represent the nation. Unless families can make sacrifices, heaven's nation will not emerge. Blessed families must sacrifice in order to see that nation arise. I'll finish here. Please join in prayer. Dear Heavenly Parent, thank you so much for this chance to be together as a holy community. Father, we have ancestors that stretch back thousands of years, and we're part of a story, a letter in the scroll, as Rabbi Sachs said. One word, a sentence on a page, pages of our life, part of a large book, part of a story in the library. Father, we have a very strong sense of who we are, and I really pray you can guide all of us to really protect our culture and our way of life, even in the face of so many difficulties in our Western liberal culture, especially now when we're in the last days. Father, we really pray you can move your hand over each one of us, that we can feel your spirit, that we can feel your breath. Father, we want to. Thank you so much for all the things that you gave us and who we are. I pray this in the name of Timothy Reed, Central West Family, our Jew.